Our scripture reading for this morning comes from the book of Luke, chapter 24, verses 1 through 12. But on the first day of the week, at early dawn, they came to the tomb, taking the spices that they had prepared. They found the stone rolled away from the tomb, but when they went in, they did not find the body. While they were perplexed about this, suddenly 2 men in dazzling clothes stood beside them. The women were terrified and bowed their faces to the ground, but the men said to them, "Why do you look for the living among the dead? He is not here, but he has risen. Remember how he told you while he was still in Galilee that the Son of Man must be handed over to sinners, to be crucified, and on the 3rd day rise again." Then they remembered his words, and returning from the tomb, they told this to the 11 and to all the rest. Now it was Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary, the mother of James, and the other women with them who told this to the apostles. But these words seemed to them an idle tale, and they did not believe them. But Peter got up and ran to the tomb. Stooping and looking in, he saw the linen clothes by themselves. Then he went home, amazed at what had happened. Here ends the lesson. May God transform understanding into action. Amen.
Amen. First off, let me say, Nancy, I feel like you and Deborah have already taken us to church. And that last bit right there was just the perfect mic drop. It almost feels extraneous for me to add anything to it. So I'm going to do my best this morning, but I'm not making any promises that I can do better than what you just did. We finally made it to Easter. We've made it all the way through this somewhat instructional season of Lent, this preparatory season of Lent that is really designed to get our hearts and our minds in the right place every year so that Easter doesn't fall on unreceptive ears or on essentially unfertile soil in our hearts. We have to do the preparatory work every year to make sure that we are actually receptive to the Easter story. And so having done that work, and we each do that work in different ways, sometimes it's simply recognizing that Easter is coming, and so making a commitment to come to services at some point during the Lenten season or on Easter Sunday. For some, it's a practice that you may undertake. I know many of us were using centering prayer on Tuesday nights, a contemplative practice that's designed to help us connect mind, body, and spirit so that it's not all an intellectual pursuit, but faith that is actually grounded in our emotions. For others, they may choose to give things up this time of year that are distracting them, or adding things this time of year that they realize they're missing. But we each do this preparatory work in different ways. And yet I have to confess that I'm aware, at least somewhere in the back of my mind and my subconscious, as I'm preparing for a message like this, I'm aware that everybody comes to this space on Easter Sunday morning for different reasons. It's no secret that attendance is usually bigger around the holidays. That's an opportunity for us to see and reconnect with folks we haven't seen in a while. It's also an opportunity for us to meet new folks and connect with them for the first time. Now, for some, that attendance, that newfound attendance, may be because, I'm reconnecting with my faith. But I also want to acknowledge that for many in this space, there's family guilt, there's social pressures, there's nothing else to do, and there's lots of reasons why you might find yourself going to church on a Sunday morning. But Easter, in particular, a holiday with so much social and cultural significance, there's a lot of reasons why you might choose to attend an Easter worship service. And so I have to be prepared, at least on some level, for the possibility that anything I say will essentially not be received by at least some chunk of the folks in this space. And I have to make peace with that. I have to make peace with the fact that not everybody comes to church because they still think the church has something to offer. I have to make peace with that too. I mean, there are ministers who get up on Sunday mornings and go to work and do the ministry thing whose hearts still aren't in it. So I have to assume that, at least for some of us here, we're not really sure what we're doing in this space. That's an okay feeling. I just want to honor that for starters this morning. You know, I used to be a teacher. I was working as a TA while getting my teaching certificate, and I was teaching 7th and 8th grade English at a private Episcopal school in South Florida. It was a really fun experience. I really enjoyed it. But it was an educational experience, not just for the students, but for me, because I learned over the course of that year that patience is a virtue. Wait for the end of the sentence, that I don't often possess. Anyone who's ever been a parent or anyone who's ever worked with students can probably describe that feeling of growing irritation just under the surface that you feel as an adult when a student or a child comes to you and they're trying to explain something to you, and in the back of your mind you're thinking, why on earth are you telling me this? It doesn't seem to matter what the age is. Young people have convictions, even from a very young age, and even when we don't necessarily developmentally have the tools to describe or share our convictions with one another, we still have them. And so I think every parent or every teacher has had that experience when there's clearly something so important being shared, but you have no idea what it is. And you're just desperately trying to thread the needle of patience and kindness and compassion, at least until you see where this is going. And I use that example of students because, interestingly enough, I often feel like the student in this scenario coming to church. In some sense, it almost feels like giving a book report every Sunday. My hope is that you've also done enough reading to know if I've done my reading. But sometimes, and I have to confess, I've been feeling this way lately, sometimes, particularly as I see the amount of upheaval in the world, I bring this Christianity thing to you, and I lay it at your feet, and I sometimes feel like a child. And then Jesus said, it's going to be okay, and they were scared, but everything turned out okay. I hope I'm a little more articulate than that, but sometimes my message seems just that foundational and just as much like it's falling on deaf ears and maybe is irrelevant. Saw a news story that got me thinking about Christian irrelevance this week. A news story about a pastor who, I'm not sure what his logic was, but essentially allowed his own youth group to treat him like Jesus. Did you see this in the news? This was a very bizarre story, and there's a YouTube video up. It's been circulating. It went viral. This pastor, he was a youth pastor, and he, in a youth gathering that was designed to simulate the crucifixion, removed his shirt and allowed his students to spit on him, to cut him with a butter knife, and do a bunch of other cockamamie things that don't make any sense to me. Of course, the pastor apologized, the church apologized. I don't think he's going to be working there anymore, I'm not sure. At least I hope not. And I think, my God, is this the story we're telling? The story that sort of fetishizes misery and suffering and then doesn't offer an alternative? And to our kids at that. I mean, I acknowledge on some level that we're in a particular cultural moment that feels like the church is still recycling its same old bag of tricks and we've run out of things to say. And that's when things get really weird. And some youth pastor cracks out the butter knife. It's not unique to America. I mean, when you look internationally, reenacted passions, reenacted crucifixions in which individuals are actually crucified, this is a thing that happens annually. It's really gross. And so it's under that sense of what are we doing here and what is the church saying in 2019 that I look to the women in this passage, whose message also fell on deaf ears, and the speaking of which probably made them feel a little ridiculous, because the tone that we're given in this passage is that the men kind of ridiculed them for being hysterical. And so the women, in their excitement, their fear, their anticipation, and frankly their honor at being the first to transmit the gospel message, although they are not aware of it at the time, go to the disciples, Jesus' friends, and say, something has happened. And the men say, there, I'm sure it's not what you thought. You probably took a wrong turn at the wrong tomb. You got lost somewhere, ended up at the wrong tomb, got confused, thought he resurrected. That's all it is. So Peter goes down, and of course what happens? Oh my goodness, they were right. But he never says, oh my goodness, they were right. And we never get that apology moment where he sort of says, oh, by the way, foot extended firmly into mouth. We have to imagine it. But these women were transmitting a story that was of vital importance to them, that could potentially, and we now know, was life-changing for them. And it fell on deaf ears. And it didn't fall on deaf or unreceptive ears, not because the disciples were necessarily malicious. I mean, the misogyny thing is one thing, but a guy coming back to life, I mean, it does kind of beggar some disbelief. Furthermore, their movement, this religious and political and social movement that had risen up under this very strange Jesus fellow, had been scattered on the winds in light of the passion and the crucifixion. And so in many ways, the disciples are in the grieving process because they see what a mess the world is in, and resurrection just doesn't make a lot of sense to them, in theory or in practice. And so when the message arrives, their thought is, yeah, but look at how messy it is. There's no way we can find hope in the middle of this. You must be hysterical. There's no way we're coming back from this. The Romans were skeptical. The Jewish high priests were skeptical. And we told them we were right, but actually it turns out we were wrong, and there'll be no living with them after this. But the women at the tomb say, wait, I'm telling you this for a reason. Pay attention. Their invitation to pay attention is extended to each and every one of us, and has been for the last 2,000 plus years. But we have to listen for it. And then once we've listened for it, we have to be receptive to it. And then, as is the case with the gospel, like a domino effect, we then share the message we have received in whatever way we receive it. And yeah, that message gets filtered through our own particular experiences. I mean, I imagine if you ask the women at the tomb to describe Jesus Christ, their description of Jesus is going to be colored by that experience at the tomb. Whereas if you ask someone else who encountered Jesus in a different way, perhaps their description would be colored by that very different experience. So too, you and I each encounter God differently. And so then when we share that encounter, it's filtered through our experience. That's a benefit. And we see it in the gospel passage this morning. Because it took the voices of these women who were met with skepticism. It took the voices of these women who were initially poo-pooed and dismissed. It took the voices and the stories of these people who were then marginalized, frankly, by the church. I saw a comic strip on Facebook this week making the rounds. It was the women from the tomb meeting with the disciples, and the disciples, in a very dismissive way, simply say, the text at the bottom read, "Thanks, ladies, we'll take it from here." But it feels that way sometimes, doesn't it? If you look at Christian history, Jesus meets the women at the tomb first. The disciples, the men, are skeptical. The powers that be aren't even receptive to the Christian message. Upon this rock I will build my church. Where is Peter? He doesn't even believe them when he tells them. He goes to the tomb. What is this? Haven't they already told you he is risen? And yet, those voices are the ones that get stamped out. And it's the men in their skepticism. It's the institutional leaders, the authoritarians, the powers that be who end up controlling the message. Why am I telling you this? Because as you encounter the gospel story, and as you do that filtering work we've talked about, hopefully in your Lenten preparation, you've made yourself receptive to the gospel message so that you can transmit it accordingly in whatever way you were made to transmit it. But I'm telling you this because it doesn't just stop with your reception of the message. Even if you get it the first time, even if you're not as stubborn or as skeptical as Peter. Because once you've got it, then you have to do something with it. Now, you may think to yourself, I'm not equipped to do anything with it. I'm not clergy. I'm not a biblical scholar. I'm not a musician, or whatever you might think you aren't. And that's okay. You don't have to be any of those things. Because as we look at this story, it was the people who were on the outside who saw it first and who got it first. It was the folks who were perhaps ill-equipped to communicate what they had experienced, who maybe felt that they, like a child coming to an authoritarian parent, are saying, but. And maybe you find that when you choose to speak, that but is the only thing that comes out. And you think that's proof that I can't do anything. I have nothing to offer the world. I'm not articulate, perhaps. I'm not, an intellectual. I'm not a volunteer spirit. I don't know. We talk ourselves out of doing anything because we find all of the things we aren't, and we don't pay attention to the things we are. Why am I telling you this? Today may or may not feel like he is risen for you. Talked about that last year. You may or may not actually experience that resurrective uplift of the emotions, that feeling that things are okay. I woke up this morning and bombings in Sri Lanka. I don't feel like everything's okay. And it doesn't take the bombing of the church to not be okay. Al-Aqsa Mosque, the burning of Notre Dame, endless gun violence, Yemen. The list goes on and on and on. And so we can run the risk, friends, of talking ourselves out of ever sharing a message of hope because we look at all of the things we aren't, we look at all the problems that need to be solved, and we say, I'm out. There's no way. I can't face this on my own. And guess what? You don't have to. Why am I telling you this? Because very soon, and it's already started, there's no exact date, exact moment that it happens. You do it your whole lives. But when we open these doors, when the service ends and you go out into the world, it will then be your turn to tell that story. You will become Christ, resurrected to somebody. Whether you woke up this morning intending to be or not. Surprise! Holy surprises. Why am I telling you this? Because he is risen. Which isn't the end. It means we've got a lot of work to do. Let's get to it. Amen.